The chairperson of the Africana Studies Department at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. AAl-Hadid, before we had our short commercial break, we were talking about the racial configurations, I guess, in Brazil. But let's allow you to continue that discussion to not only talk about South America, but to bring in some information relative to North America and make the comparisons and et cetera that you'd like to make.
Yeah, one thing I think is very important, if you study the last days of Malcolm X, especially when he formed this organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he came up with the concept of Afro-American. Now, when we think of Afro-American, we think of Africans, of people of African descent inside of America. But when Malcolm spoke of African Americans, he was talking about brothers in the Caribbean and South America, that whole idea of Afro being people, anyone of African descent in the diaspora. And so the thing that we have to recognize here inside the United States, that we have Africans from all parts of the world. We have Africans in this country from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from Nigeria, from Ghana. And this configuration inside of America almost is a microcosm of the African world. So we have a microcosm of the African continent, and we also have a microcosm of the African world. And one of the big problems that we struggle with in the field of Africana studies is to get people of African descent talking to each other in spite of who they were colonized by. A lot of times, because our brothers are from the Spanish-speaking part of the world, they might be Puerto Ricans, or they might be of some other group that speaks Spanish, or from Mexico or Panama, then we don't tend to identify them because we see them as being different. See them more being as Spanish than they are of African. And they play into the same kind of concept. And so that strategy that the colonizers use of divide and rule still is in effect, because now we're divided by languages. And that's one of the main reasons we put a strong emphasis on our majors learning a European language other than English, so that when we go to places such as Martinique, where they speak French, our students can communicate. Or if we go to Senegal, they can communicate beyond the barrier of the English language. So I think it's very important for us inside of America who are of African descent to start having more authentic dialogue and interaction with each other. Now, one of the things that we're doing at Tennessee State University is that we have created a new organization called the African Student Association. And when the brother came to me to form that organization, at first he wanted to form an organization that would represent continental Africans. But I told him, I said, Africa is where Africans are. So he expanded the concept. Whole concept. So now this organization comprises students from the African continent, from the Caribbean, from South America. So if you are a black man, as Peter Tarr said, you're an African.
Regardless of how you might describe yourself.
How you might describe yourself, and regardless of the fact that you don't speak Kiswahili or Yoruba or Hausa, the fact is that genetically and historically and even culturally, we're still just as African as we ever were.
Very good. Now let's look at the introduction of the African into North America here, because I think you've given us quite a bit of information about his relationship in South America. But what about North America? And sort of look at that and give us some kind of comparison between the two areas. Why is it that we don't seem to recognize as Africans in North America those Africans in South America?
One thing that I think is important to realize is that a lot of times when we think about Afro-American history or African-American history, the first thing we start with Jamestown, Virginia, 1619. And we fail to realize that the slaves didn't, in the beginning, didn't come directly from West Africa to Jamestown, Virginia. That many of them were taken to the Caribbean, where they underwent what the slave masters called seasoning, where they were broken in, where they were beaten unmercifully to the extent that they stopped speaking their African language, they stopped speaking they stopped practicing their various African religions. And then after the slave masters felt that they had been domesticated or seasoned, then they were brought to North America and put inside of 13 colonies. So we have to remember that whole middle passage coming from the Guinea coast, from West Africa, then going to the Caribbean, and then we were broken in there and then brought to the east coast of the United States. So that is the connection through the Middle Passage. We were Caribbeans before we were African Americans.
And so there's more of a relationship between Africa and South America and the Caribbeans, and then into the North American continent, rather than directly from Africa to the North American continent.
It was very late in the slave trade when slaves would start coming directly from West Africa. They always went to the Caribbean, and then they were brought inside of the United States. But it was at that point they had been just humiliated and degraded to the point that they were just many of them just didn't have the will to rebel against the slave system. On the other hand, there were those that did not work on the plantation in Jamaica. They, as I said earlier, ran into the mountains. These were called the Maroons. These are people that deserve. And you find the same phenomenon took place in Suriname, which was a Dutch colony. It was colonized by the Dutch. They went into the mountains and set up their own community. As a matter of fact, one of our graduates, Levi Watkins Jr., actually went into the Suriname to study an African community there. And that community is an exact replica of a comparable community in Africa itself.
And of course, all of these are, might be what you call Africana survivals, and survivals dealing with this period. You know, I think, Dr. AAl-Hadid, one of the things that many people fail to realize is that while we talk about the Africans in North America and South America, many of us fail to really grasp the economic importance of the slave trade. Let's talk about it from that perspective. I mean, how profitable was it when you dealt with slaves, and what part did slavery play in the overall economy of those particular areas?
Well, first of all, we have to realize that the transatlantic slave trade set the stage for capitalism in this country. It set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. It's what is called the stage of primitive accumulation. And in that process, there was a system that they created called the triangular trade, where ships, people invested in slave ships. There was a stock market in Europe. They could go to there's a street rather, in England called Derby Street, which is like Wall Street in the United States. And people could invest in a slave cargo. Then the slave traders would go to West Africa, get the slaves, take them to the Caribbean, force them to work on the plantation where they would produce sugar cane. The sugar cane was then sold and made into rum, and that rum was taken back to Europe and sold so that the profits came in. In many instances, the slave venture was 200, 300% profits. So there was an enormous amount of money made on the slave trade because it was an investment.
And let me interrupt you here, Dr. AAl-Hadid, and to take this second commercial break, after which we'll come back and we'll deal with some of the other aspects of this. Let us have this second commercial break, and we'll be the chairperson of